So as you know, half of our country's in lockdown, millions told to stay home, the rest of the country suffering restrictions and border closures as fear is whipped up by our so-called leaders. But over in China, the epicentre, the origins of the pandemic, it's all smiles and celebrations. Tomorrow marks 100 years since the Communist Party of China was founded. Commemorations are already taking place right across the country, including at Beijing's Bird's Nest Olympic Stadium. Extraordinary stuff, isn't it? Theatrical performance, fireworks, even a greeting from Chinese astronauts in space. We're told the audience stood up and proudly sang there would be no China without the Communist Party. A few facts were conveniently wiped from the historical record, though. There was no mention of the Cultural Revolution that resulted in 45 million deaths, or the deadly crackdown on protesters in Tiananmen Square in June 1989. That too was airbrushed from history. The persecution and treatment of the Uyghurs, that didn't rate a mention either. But there was time, of course, to celebrate China's defeat of the pandemic. Performers dressed as nurses in protective gear and hundreds of soldiers wearing face masks paraded around the stadium, the celebrations conveniently ignoring the elephant in the room, the origin of the virus and the Wuhan lab leak theory. But you wouldn't expect anything different from a country which operates on fear, hypocrisy and propaganda, would you? Michael Shoebridge is the Director of Defence Strategy and National Security at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thanks for joining us again, Michael. This is an extraordinary show. This is celebrating not just 100 years, is it? This is celebrating an ascendant China and Xi Jinping as a dictator at his prime, really.
Well, Chris, I think that is what he's attempting to do with the celebration. But, you know, this whole thing starts with some lies and half-truths. The actual birth date of the Chinese Communist Party is the 23rd of July, not the 1st of July. So that's odd. But this celebration is all about the ruling 90 million member Chinese Communist Party, indulging in self-congratulatory self-adulation and celebration while desperately trying to make the 1.4 billion Chinese people identify with the party. And it's in the wider world, China has never been as badly perceived as it is now under Xi. Xi has done extraordinary damage to China's image and position in the world. He's lucky there's a global pandemic because the absence of world leaders that just a few years ago would have been a conga line to be part of the party is now masked by the pandemic. So there's some very important underlying issues around this stage-managed planned spontaneity we're seeing in Beijing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good thing that other world leaders weren't there bowing and scraping. What about the history of this too? The fact that the Chinese Communist Party was founded basically as an offshoot of the Bolsheviks in Russia. And also this idea that it must grate, even with the Chinese living under the yoke of communism, the idea there would be no China without the Communist Party. This was a great civilization, thousands of years. They can't claim to have invented or protected or constructed China.
Well, this is an enormous part of the propaganda narrative that the party is pushing down the throats of the Chinese people. They want the 1.4 billion people to identify themselves with the party and China with the party. And that's why terminology is so important. This is the celebration of a 100-year-old Chinese Communist Party that has ruled as a single-party authoritarian regime for 72 of those years. You know, the other long-term ruling parties, there's now dead Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF, that's only ruled Zimbabwe for 41 years. And even the Communist Party of the Soviet Union that you mentioned was only 88 when the Berlin Wall fell and ruled the former Soviet Union for 74 years. So this is a geriatric party that's trying to convey the spirit of youth. And unfortunately, their leader now is an unconstrained individual like Mao. And the damage Mao caused to the Chinese people, the party and China in the world is a real warning sign for China under Xi.
Just get your thoughts, Michael, on the manifestation of this back in Australia with a report from Human Rights Watch talking about the, I suppose, intimidation, certainly the surveillance of Chinese students in Australian universities. And they've had Chinese students being warned on social media while they're in Australia, we're watching you. Chinese students who might get involved in a pro-democracy movement or a pro-Hong Kong movement. We've seen manifestations of this through some significant cases. But just how extensive is this, and what could universities do to protect their students better?
Well, Chris, universities have known about this for some time, but this really deep Human Rights Watch report has some fantastic research, speaking with Chinese students and with Australian academics. Now, one of the Chinese students said, I have to censor myself. This is the reality. I come to Australia and still I'm not free. And the report uncovered that Chinese police had visited Chinese students' homes in China because of what the students were saying in Australia. So this reminds me of August last year, the University of New South Wales removing the article of a lecturer because it offended nationalist Chinese students, pro-party students, and issuing an apology in Mandarin, a cringing apology for having the temerity to have a lecturer have views like that. So this is a known problem. Universities have been too beholden to Chinese money and too intimidated by the Chinese government. Now they get to change the way they operate, and they're only doing it because other people have brought the problem to light.
Michael, thanks so much for shedding light on all that for us again.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Michael Shoebridge there, live from Canberra.